The scene was unprecedented in international security cooperation. In the newly established Joint Security Coordination Center in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, two men from entirely different continents stood side by side, united by a revolutionary vision. President Ibrahim Traoré, the young military officer who had risen to lead his nation, and General Óscar Naranjo, the legendary Colombian security strategist who had dismantled the world's most powerful drug cartels, were launching an alliance that would send shockwaves through global security establishments as they shook hands before the assembled officials and media. Few could have predicted this unlikely partnership. What exactly had brought together an African revolutionary leader and a Latin American counter-narcotics expert? And why were Western powers so concerned about their collaboration? The answer lay in years of failed security interventions and a radical new approach that threatened to upend traditional power dynamics in international security assistance. For years, security challenges in the Sahel region had been addressed, primarily through Western interventions. France's Operation Barkhane deployed thousands of troops across the region. The United States established military bases and training programs through ARICOM. European Union missions provided funding and advisors. Yet, despite these massive investments of foreign resources, the security situation had only deteriorated. Armed groups continued to expand their territorial control. Civilian casualties mounted and public trust in both foreign forces and local governments eroded steadily. The failures were apparent to all, but the solutions remained elusive. Western security models, with their emphasis on high-tech surveillance, drone strikes, and conventional military operations, seemed ill-suited to the complex socio-political landscape of the Sahel. Meanwhile, dependency relationships created by these interventions undermined African sovereignty and prevented the development of locally appropriate security approaches in the northern provinces of Burkina Faso. The situation had become particularly dire. Villages that had once been centers of commerce and community life stood abandoned. Their inhabitants fled to overcrowded displacement camps. Schools remained closed for years, creating a generation of children without education. Health centers operated sporadically, if at all. Armed groups established parallel governance systems, collecting taxes and dispensing their harsh version of justice. The Western security approach created a terrible paradox, explained Dr. Ousmane Dio, security analyst who had documented the deterioration across the Sahel. Foreign forces would secure an area temporarily, then leave. Armed groups would return and punish anyone who had cooperated with the foreigners. Communities were caught in an impossible position, viewed with suspicion by both sides and protected by neither. This was the context in which Ibrahim Traoré came to power in Burkina Faso in September 2022. A 34-year-old military officer with a reputation for both battlefield courage and intellectual depth. Traoré immediately signaled a dramatic shift in how his country would approach security challenges. In January 2023, he ordered French forces to leave Burkina Faso, ending a decade-long military presence. In the following months, he began reorienting the country's security strategy toward greater self-reliance and regional cooperation. The decision to expel French forces was controversial internationally, but broadly supported domestically. Years of French military presence had not delivered the security improvements repeatedly promised. Instead, many Burkinab had come to see these forces as primarily protecting French interests rather than local populations. Public demonstrations supporting Traoré's decision filled the streets of Ouagadougou with signs declaring security, sovereignty, and African solutions to African problems. In a landmark speech outlining his new vision, Traoré explained that the fundamental problem with foreign security assistance was not the intentions of partners, but the models they brought. These models were developed for different contexts, different threats, different societies. What Burkina Faso needed were approaches that emerged from its own realities, cultures, and understandings of security. This philosophy led Traoré to look beyond the traditional providers of security assistance to Africa. If Western models weren't working, perhaps there were lessons to be learned from countries that had faced similar challenges and developed their own solutions. His attention turned to Latin America and specifically to Colombia, a nation that had transformed itself from the brink of becoming a failed state dominated by cartels to one of the region's security success stories. The architect of much of Colombia's security transformation had been General Óscar Naranjo, as head of the Colombian National Police and later as vice president. Naranjo had pioneered innovative approaches to combating non-state armed groups. Rather than focusing solely on military force, his strategy had emphasized intelligence networks, community partnerships, targeted operations against leadership structures, and addressing the social and economic factors that drove recruitment. Naranjo's approach had been particularly notable for its emphasis on ethical practice. Unlike some security forces that responded to terrorism with extrajudicial methods, Naranjo had insisted on maintaining legal and moral boundaries even in the most challenging circumstances. This commitment had not only preserved democratic values, but had proven strategically effective, building public trust and legitimacy that ultimately isolated armed groups from potential supporters. General Naranjo understood something that Western security experts often miss, noted Dr. Aminata Deo, Burkina Faso's newly appointed special advisor on security strategy. He recognized that defeating armed groups requires not just superior firepower, but superior understanding of their structures, their motivations, their relationships with communities. Most importantly, he understood that sustainable security can only be built with the people, not imposed upon them. Traoré's interest in Naranjo's expertise led to initial diplomatic outreach through Colombia's embassy in neighboring Ghana. The response was positive, but complicated by geopolitical realities. According to sources close to the negotiations, Western powers that had long dominated security assistance in Africa expressed concerns about this potential partnership, pressuring Colombia to limit any cooperation to symbolic exchanges rather than substantive collaboration. There was a clear attempt to prevent this knowledge transfer, revealed Foreign Minister Gibel Bozel. It was as if certain countries believed they should maintain a monopoly on security expertise in Africa even, though their own approaches had failed to deliver results. This resistance reflected deeper concerns about shifting power dynamics in international security cooperation. For decades, Western nations had positioned themselves as the primary providers of security expertise globally. The possibility of effective South-South security partnerships threatened not just this role, but the influence that came with it. If African nations could develop effective security approaches, without Western guidance, a significant lever of geopolitical influence would be lost. Undeterred, Traoré took the extraordinary step of personally calling Naranjo, who had retired from government service but remained active as a security consultant and advisor to several Latin American nations. The conversation, which lasted over 2 hours, explored parallels between Colombia's past struggles and Burkina Faso's current challenges. By the end, Naranjo had agreed to visit Ouagadougou to assess the situation firsthand. That initial visit in March 2025 was intended to last 3 days. Naranjo ended up staying for 3 weeks, traveling extensively throughout the country, meeting with military officers, community leaders, former fighters, and victims of violence. What he found both concerned and inspired him. His travels took him to frontline communities in the northern Sahel region, where he witnessed firsthand the complex dynamics between armed groups, local populations, and security forces. In the eastern mining regions, he observed how resource exploitation created conditions for both conflict and potential economic development. In displacement camps, he heard testimonies from civilians caught in the crossfire between insurgents and counterinsurgency operations. The parallels with early 2000s Colombia are striking, Naranjo observed in his preliminary assessment. You have armed groups exploiting legitimate grievances, financing themselves through illicit economies, establishing alternative governance in neglected areas, and using terror tactics to control populations. But you also have resilient communities, capable security forces that lack strategic direction, and a leadership now committed to finding indigenous solutions rather than importing foreign models. What had been planned as a brief consulting engagement evolved into something far more substantial. At the conclusion of his extended visit, Naranjo and Traoré announced the establishment of a comprehensive security partnership. The Colombian general would assemble a team of specialists who had been directly involved in his country's security transformation and deploy them to Burkina Faso for a minimum of 1 year. Together with Burkina counterparts, they would develop and implement a new security strategy specifically adapted to the Sahel context. The team Naranjo assembled reflected the multidimensional nature of the security challenges. It included not only military and police strategists, but also experts in rural development, conflict resolution, public communications, and intelligence analysis. Many were veterans of Colombia's most difficult periods, bringing practical experience rather than just theoretical knowledge. Crucially, the team included individuals who had themselves grown up in conflict-affected communities, understanding the civilian perspective that was often missing from security planning. This announcement sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Western powers that had long dominated security assistance in Africa expressed concerns about this unorthodox partnership. Some questioned Naranjo's current role as a private citizen rather than an official government representative. Others suggested that Colombia's experience was not transferable to the African context. French officials were particularly vocal in their skepticism, with one defense ministry spokesperson warning that experimental security approaches could further destabilize an already fragile region. American responses were more measured publicly, but reportedly more forceful through diplomatic channels, with pressure applied on both Colombian and Burkina officials to reconsider the arrangement. The skepticism is understandable but misplaced, responded Naranjo when questioned by journalists. Of course, Colombia is not identical to Burkina Faso, but we understand something that perhaps others do not: what it means to fight for your country's future against groups that blend criminality, terrorism, and pseudo-political agendas. We know what it's like to do this while building democratic institutions and addressing legitimate social grievances. Most importantly, we know what it's like to do this as a developing nation without unlimited resources. The partnership formally launched in May 2025 with the establishment of the Joint Security Coordination Center in Ouagadougou. The center, housed in a repurposed government building rather than a heavily fortified compound, became the nerve center for a fundamentally different approach to security in the Sahel. The location itself was symbolic of the new approach. Unlike Western security operations, typically conducted from fortified bases isolated from local populations, the center was deliberately integrated into the community. Local residents were invited to community meetings held in its courtyard. Its cafeteria served local food and was open to both security personnel and civilians. While appropriate security measures were in place, the facility projected accessibility rather than separation. At the heart of the new strategy was a complete reimagining of intelligence gathering and analysis. Whereas Western approaches had emphasized technical collection methods, satellite imagery, drone surveillance, communications, interception, the Colombian Burkina model prioritized human intelligence networks deeply embedded in local communities. Technical intelligence has its place, explained Colonel Maria Jimenez, one of Naranjo's key lieutenants in Colombia's fight against the cartels. But it cannot tell you what people are thinking, what they fear, what they hope for. It cannot distinguish between a farmer who joins an armed group out of conviction and one who joins out of coercion. These distinctions are crucial for developing effective responses. The new approach trained hundreds of intelligence officers, not just in clandestine tradecraft, but in cultural understanding, conflict resolution, and community development. These officers were deployed not as anonymous operatives, but as known government representatives in communities threatened by armed groups, building relationships of trust that yielded information far more valuable than what could be captured by surveillance technology. The training itself reflected the partnership's innovative approach, rather than separating intelligence officers from the communities they would serve. Much of the training took place in the field, with officers living in villages and learning directly from local knowledge systems. They studied local languages, cultural practices, historical grievances, and economic conditions, building a nuanced understanding that no satellite image could provide. Before, intelligence was something done to communities, noted Ibrahim Sawadogo, a village elder from the northern Sahel region. Now, it is something done with communities. These new officers don't just ask about armed groups, they ask about our needs, our concerns. They help solve problems. So naturally, people are more willing to share information with them. This community-centric approach extended to military operations as well, rather than large-scale sweeps that often alienated civilian populations. The new strategy emphasized precision operations, targeting specific individuals identified as key nodes in armed group networks. These operations were planned with meticulous attention to minimizing civilian impacts and were typically followed immediately by civil affairs initiatives addressing community needs. The operational planning process itself was transformed. Before any significant action, detailed analysis was conducted on potential civilian impacts, not as an afterthought, but as a central consideration. Local leaders were consulted on timing and approach whenever security considerations allowed. After operations, immediate feedback was gathered from communities and incorporated into planning for future actions. General Naranjo taught us to think differently about what victory means, explained Colonel Adama Arago, commander of Burkinafaso's newly formed Special Operations Group. It's not about body counts or territory controlled on a map. It's about breaking the armed group's ability to function as coherent organizations while building community resilience against their influence. This requires incredible precision, both operational and ethical. The results of this approach began to emerge within months. In the northern province of Somme, a notorious commander of Jamaat Nasr al-Islam wal Muslimin, Akin, was captured in an operation that resulted in no civilian casualties. Rather than being paraded before cameras or subjected to harsh interrogation, he was treated with respect and encouraged to provide insights into the group's structure and motivations. The intelligence gained led to the peaceful surrender of several mid-level commanders and dozens of fighters. In the eastern region, where gold mining had financed armed group activities, a combination of targeted operations against trafficking networks and community-based mining governance initiatives reduced violent incidents by 40% in just 4 months. Local mining cooperatives, now protected from extortion, began partnering with security forces, providing information that further degraded armed group capabilities. These operational successes were complemented by innovative approaches to countering extremist narratives, drawing on Colombia's experience with demobilization and reintegration of former fighters. The partnership established dialogue channels with certain armed group factions while isolating hardline elements. A carefully designed amnesty program offered paths back to civilian life for those who had joined armed groups under duress or for economic reasons rather than ideological commitment. The amnesty program was particularly controversial internationally, but showed promising results. Former fighters who surrendered underwent a rigorous vetting process, psychological assessment, and community reconciliation procedures. They received vocational training and reintegration support, but also contributed to community service projects as a form of restorative justice. Their insights into armed group operations proved invaluable for developing more effective counter-terrorism strategies. The Western approach tends to lump all armed actors together as terrorists to be eliminated, observed Dr. Carlos Vega, a Colombian expert in conflict resolution who joined Naranjo's team. We learned in Colombia that armed groups are rarely monolithic. They contain ideologues, opportunists, coerced participants, and many who join simply for protection or livelihood. By disaggregating these groups, you can peel away layers of support and isolate the truly irreconcilable elements. This nuanced understanding extended to addressing the structural factors that enabled armed group recruitment. Working with local communities, the partnership identified specific grievances that had been exploited by extremist narratives, from land disputes to ethnic marginalization to abuses by security forces. Task forces composed of both security and development specialists were formed to address these issues, creating tangible evidence that the government could deliver justice and opportunity more effectively than armed groups. In one notable example, a district in the Nord region had experienced persistent conflict stemming from disputes between agricultural and pastoral communities over land and water access. Armed groups had exploited these tensions, positioning themselves as protectors of whichever community felt more vulnerable. The task force facilitated locally developed resource-sharing agreements, established community monitoring mechanisms, and provided technical support for more efficient use of limited resources. Within 6 months, armed group recruitment from these communities had virtually ceased. Perhaps most significantly, the entire approach was designed to build institutional capacity rather than dependency. Unlike Western security assistance, which often created parallel structures staffed by foreign advisors, the Colombian team worked explicitly to transfer knowledge and develop Burkina capabilities. Every aspect of the strategy was documented in operational manuals adapted to local context. Training programs were established to ensure continuity beyond the partnership's formal duration. "We are not here to fight your battles for you," Naranjo emphasized in an address to Burkina security forces. "We are here to share what we learned through our own struggles, often through painful trial and error. Our goal is that within 1 year, you will not need our presence at all. Only perhaps our occasional counsel as colleagues and friends." This philosophy of genuine partnership rather than dependency represented a stark contrast to Western security assistance models. French Operation Barkhane had maintained direct operational control of key security functions for years, creating little space for local forces to develop their own capabilities. American programs had trained Burkina units, but often in tactics. ILs suited to local conditions and without addressing strategic or institutional frameworks. The difference is ownership, reflected Defense Minister Ibrahim Traoré. No relation to the president. With previous partners, we always felt like junior participants in our own security. With the Colombian partnership, we are true co-creators of the strategy. They respect our knowledge of our own context while sharing their technical expertise as equals. This sense of equity and mutual respect extended to the practical arrangements of the partnership. Unlike Western advisors who typically lived in heavily fortified compounds separated from the population, the Colombian team integrated into normal neighborhoods in Ouagadougou. They learned basic phrases in local languages, participated in community events, and adapted to local customs. This approach not only built trust, but provided deeper insight into the social dynamics underlying security challenges. The partnership's impact extended beyond Burkina Faso's borders. As initial successes became apparent, neighboring Mali and Niger expressed interest in adopting similar approaches. In July 2025, the Alliance of Sahel States, a mutual defense pact between the three nations, formally invited Naranjo to present his methodology to their joint military command. This regional dimension was particularly significant given the leisure of armed group operations across the Sahel. Armed groups don't respect borders. So security strategies can't be confined to single countries, noted Naranjo. 1. Of Colombia's key lessons was the importance of coordinated approaches across the region. The existing alliance between these Sahel nations creates an opportunity for coherent strategy that was missing in early stages of Colombia's security response. For many observers, the partnership represented something more significant than just an innovative security approach. It embodied a broader shift in international relations. The emergence of South-South cooperation as a viable alternative to traditional North-South assistance models. This partnership challenges fundamental assumptions about who has expertise to share and who needs to receive it, noted Dr. Aminata, a professor of international relations at the University of Ouagadougou. For generations, the flow of knowledge was assumed to be from global North to global South. Now we're seeing that countries with shared experiences of colonialism, underdevelopment, and internal conflict may have more relevant insights to exchange with each other than those coming from wealthy nations with very different historical contexts. As the sun set over Ouagadougou, the lights burned late at the Joint Security Coordination Center. Inside, Burkina and Colombian specialists pored over maps, analyzed intelligence reports, and refined operational plans. The conversations flowed between French, Spanish, and local languages, occasionally punctuated by laughter or passionate debate. There was no hierarchy of foreign experts instructing local implementers, just professionals from different continents working together to solve common problems. This scene replicated daily across various security institutions in Burkina. Faso represented something profound. A new model of international cooperation based not on donor-recipient dynamics, but on shared experience and mutual respect. The Traoré Naranjo partnership had demonstrated that the most effective solutions to Africa's security challenges might come not from traditional Western partners, but from other nations that had walked similar paths through their own histories. As armed group activity continued to decline and communities began to experience genuine security improvements, this lesson was not lost on observers across Africa and beyond. A new chapter in South-South cooperation had been written, one that would influence security relationships long after the specific partnership had evolved into its next phase. In the words of a banner hanging in the CENT's main operations room, displaying a proverb that resonated in both African and Latin American cultures, those who face the same storms can teach each other how to build stronger ships. Music,